In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Christ is risen, my dear friends. Truly he is risen. Let us pray, and we will continue our readings of St. Gregory of Nyssa's life of Moses. Christ has risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ has risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ has risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. So today we will hopefully continue the wonderful reading that we've started of St. Gregory of Nyssa. And if memory serves me right, we stopped at paragraph 34, so we will continue with 35. If I happen to repeat myself, do forgive me. Again their guide, the cloud, rose up and led them forth to another place. But this was a desert with arid, scorching sand and not a drop of water to moisten the country. Here once more thirst exhausted the people, but when Moses struck a prominent rock with his rod, it gave forth water which was sweet and drinkable in greater abundance than was needed by even so large a host. I do believe that we did read this before. Paragraph 36. It was also there by the provisions which they had laid in for their journey out of Egypt failed, and the people were famished. Then the most incredible marvel of all occurred. Food did not grow out of the earth in the customary manner, but fell like dew from heaven. For the dew was poured out upon them at daybreak, and became food for those who gathered it. What was poured out was not drops of water, as in the case of dew, but crystal-like drops in the shape of coriander seed, tasting as sweet as honey. Apparently, the Hebrew word manna means, what is this? And it's quite possible that the reason why to this day we continue referring to what God provided for them as food in the desert as manna, because when they saw it, all of them said, what is this? And apparently in the language of their day, that what is this was manna, manna, manna. So what is this? Chapter or paragraph 37. With this marvel was seen also another. Those who went up to gather the food were all, as one might expect, of different ages and capacities. Yet despite their differences, one did not gather more or less than another. Instead, the amount gathered was measured by the need of each, so that the stronger did not have a surplus, nor was the weaker deprived of his fair share. In addition, the history tells another marvel. Each one, when making provision for the day, laid up nothing for the morrow. But when some stingy person did store up some of the daily food for the next day, it became inedible, being changed into worms. So that obviously was a very interesting miracle, a peculiar one might say, in that if they decided to store up more for the following day so that they didn't have to labor by collecting it, by picking it up, well, it all went to waste because it turned into worms. Chapter 38. The history offers yet another astounding feature of this food. For one of the 7 days of the week was observed by rest in keeping with a mystical ordinance. On the day before the day of rest, the same amount of food flowed down as on other days, and the effort of those gathering it was the same. Yet what was gathered was found to be double the usual amount, so that their need for food was no excuse for breaking the law of rest. Divine power was shown even more in that, whereas on other days the excess became worthless, on the day of preparation for the Sabbath, which is the name of this day of rest, alone did what was stored up remain imperishable, so that in no way appeared to be less fresh than the new. So we see that this particular food, this manna from heaven, had a very miraculous quality. When it was gathered on a Friday and stored up for Saturday, it remained perfectly fine. However, when it was gathered on any other day. And if someone tried to sort of, sneak some more of it, well, then it definitely did not work very well for them. And so that, of course, is also a great miracle in and of itself, in that it did not stay other days of the week, but on Sabbath, it definitely stay fresh and completely edible. Chapter 39. Then they waged war against a foreign nation. The text calls those combining against them Amalekites. For the first time, the Israelites were drawn up fully armed in battle array. The full army was not moved into battle. Only picked troops, chosen for their merit, undertook the war. Here Moses showed a new piece of strategy. While Joshua, who was to succeed Moses in leading the people, led the army out against the Amalekites, Moses, standing on a hilltop away from the furor of a battle, was looking up toward heaven with a friend stationed on either side of him. Chapter 40. Then we hear from the history of the following marvel. When Moses raised his hands to heaven, those under his command prevailed against their enemies, but when he let them down, the army began to give in to the foreigners' assault. When those who stood with him recognized this, they stationed themselves on either side of him and supported his hands, which for some unknown reason had become heavy and hard to move. When his helpers became too weak to hold him in an upright position, they provided him a stone to sit on, thus helping Moses to raise his hands to heaven. From then on, the foreign army was mightily defeated by the Israelites. Now here, if you will allow me, I will show you that he didn't raise his hands like this. More so, he raised them in prayer like this, or sometimes, maybe considered to be like this. And of course, that sort of raising of hands signified prayer on his part. So we see that spiritually, while Moses was praying, the Israelites were winning. The moment he lowered his hands and he stopped praying, they stopped winning. And so his friends, his assistants, they basically made sure his hands didn't go down, so he did not stop praying. And perhaps in this, what we could see is the Lord says that we must make a spiritual sacrifice unto God, that we must go through a narrow path. It would be easy to pray with one's hands lowered to their natural position. Holding one's hands up for a few minutes or for a few seconds is an easy job. But if you actually try to remain standing like this for longer than a minute or 5 minutes, you will realize how soon your muscles begin to ache and you would very much wish to lower your hands. The battle obviously did not take just a couple of minutes. It lasted for perhaps over an hour. And of course, holding one's hands for that amount of time is definitely a tremendous feat, you might say, a physical feat. So in this particular case, his feat of holding up one's hands was also in some fashion, in some manner, a spiritual offering that he was offering to God. Chapter 41. When the cloud which led the people in their journey continued to remain at the same place, the people could not move on, since there was no one to lead them to depart. All the necessities of life were provided for them without toil. The air from above rained bread already prepared for them, and the rock from below provided drink. The cloud, in turn, tempered the unpleasantness of being out in the open, forming a shelter from the heat by day, and at night dispelling the darkness by shining with a torch-like radiance. So they experienced no discomfort in that desert at the foot of the mountain where they had pitched camp. Well, we know that in the desert, the temperature difference, the variance of the temperature is quite great, because during the day, as the sun heats the rocks of the desert and its sort of arid soil directly, it reflects a lot of heat and it becomes very hot. But at night, it cools very quickly and becomes very cold. So the very fact that during the day God provided them with a cloud, and at night with a sort of a column of fire raising up to heaven, well, at night they had warmth, during the day they had the shade from the sun, and that was no small thing as well. Chapter 42. Here Moses guided them in a most secret initiation. The divine power itself, by marvels beyond description, initiated all the people and their leader himself in the following manner. The people were ordered beforehand to keep themselves from defilements of all kinds which pertain to both soul and body, and to purify themselves by certain lustrations. They were to keep themselves pure from intercourse for a stated number of days, so that by pure of passion they might approach the mountain to be initiated, cleansed of every emotion and bodily concern. The name of the mountain was Sinai. Persons alone were allowed at that time to approach the mountain, and of them men alone, and of them in turn those purified from every pollution. Every safeguard and precaution was taken against the approach of any animals to the mountain. If somehow it did happen that any animal at all showed itself at the mountain, it was stoned by the people. Chapter 43. Then the clear light of the atmosphere was darkened, so that the mountain became invisible, wrapped in a dark cloud. A fire shining out of the darkness presented a fearful sight to those who saw it. It hovered all around the sides of the mountain, so that everything which one could see smoldered with the smoke from the surrounding fire. Moses led the people to the slope, not without fear himself at the sight. His whole being so trembled with fright that his faintness of soul was not concealed from the Israelites, but he was terrified as they were at what he saw, and his body shook violently. Chapter 44. The manifestation was of such a nature that it not only caused consternation in their souls through what they saw, but it also struck fear in them through what they heard. A terrible sound ripped down from above upon everything below. Its first impact was harsh and intolerable to every ear. Its sound was like a blaring of trumpets, but the intensity and terribleness of the sound surpassed any such comparison. As it drew nearer, its blaring steadily increased to a more terrifying volume. This sound was sharp and clear, the air articulating the word by divine power without using organs of speech. The word was not articulated without purpose, but was laying down divine ordinances. As the sound drew nearer, it became louder, and the trumpet surpassed itself, the successive sounds exceeding in volume the preceding ones. Chapter 45. The people as a whole were incapable of enduring what was seen and heard. Therefore, a general request from all was brought before Moses that the law be mediated through him, on the ground that the people would not doubt that whatever he commanded in keeping with the teaching from above was a divine command. So when all went down to the foot of the mountain, Moses alone remained and showed the opposite of what was expected to him. Was to be expected of him, whereas all other men feel confidence in the face of fearful things when in the company of their associates. Moses was more courageous after he had been left by himself. From this it became clear that the fear which had encompassed him at the beginning was an emotion not in keeping with his character, but was experienced out of sympathy for those who were terrified. Well, speaking of the sympathy of Moses, of course, when the people later on, as we are going to continue to read, when the people will misbehave and anger God, Moses would actually intervene on their behalf and order that God would wipe him as well out of the book of the living, unless he would have mercy on the people, because God did not want to punish Moses. He only wanted to punish the people. But Moses was so kind and so compassionate toward his people that he said, if you're going to punish them, punish me as well. And so this makes perfect sense, saying that he was really scared and afraid, not so much for himself as he was for the people. And the people, we know in that particular case, they said to Moses, they said, let God speak to you alone, because we will all surely die if we continue wanting to listen to God. Chapter 46. Since he was alone, by having been stripped, as it were, of the people's fear, he boldly approached the very darkness itself and entered the invisible things, where he was no longer seen by those watching. After he entered the inner sanctuary of the divine mystical doctrine, there, while not being seen, he was in company with the invisible. He teaches, I think, by the things he did, that the one who is going to associate intimately with God must go beyond all that is visible, and in lifting up his own mind as to a mountaintop, to the invisible and incomprehensible, believe that the divine is there where the understanding does not reach. Now, quite interestingly enough, I believe in iconography, mountains depicted in the background also depict the ascetic striving after God. And by sort of going up high, up the mountain, with both his feet and also, of course, his heart and his mind, Moses indeed communicated with God, the invisible one. Chapter 47. While there he received the divine ordinances. These were the teachings concerning virtue, the chief of which is reverence and having the proper notions about the divine nature, inasmuch as it transcends all cognitive thought and representation, and cannot be likened to anything which is known. He was commanded to heed none of those things comprehended by the notions with regard to the divine, nor to liken the transcendent nature to any of the things known by comprehension. Rather, he should believe that the divine exists, and he should not examine it with respect to quality, quantity, origin, and mode of being, since it is unattainable. I think here St. Gregory is talking about sort of the prohibition of making any images of God at that time, or images to be worshipped as gods, because obviously God was incomprehensible and unattainable to the people then. Chapter 48. The word, The word also adds what are right moral actions, presenting its teaching in both general and specific laws. General is the law which is destructive of all injustice, namely, that one must love his neighbor. If this law were observed, it would certainly follow in consequence that no one would do any evil to his neighbor. Among the specific laws was established honor of parents, and there was listed a catalogue of prohibited deeds. Chapter 49. With his mind purified by these laws, as it were, he was led to the higher initiation, where a tabernacle was all at once shown to him by divine power. The tabernacle was a sanctuary with beauty of indescribable variety, entrances, pillars, and curtains, table, candlestick, and altar of incense, the altar of Holocaust, or whole burnt offering, and the propitiatory, and the inaccessible and unapproachable Holy of Holies, so that their beauty and arrangement might not be forgotten and might be shown to those below. He was counseled not to represent these things in mere writing, but to imitate in material construction that immaterial creation, enjoying the most splendid and radiant materials found on earth. Among these, the most abundant was gold, with which the pillars were overlaid. With the gold, silver also made its contribution by beatifying the capitals and bases of the pillars, so that by the changes of color at each end, I think, the gold might shine forth more brightly. There were also places where brass was considered useful, namely at the head and the base of the silver pillars. Chapter 50. The draperies and the curtains and the outer wall of the sanctuary and the covering stretched out in succession over the columns. Each was finished out of an appropriate material by the weaver's art. The dye of these woven fabrics was violet, purple, and fiery scarlet, and some material had its natural brightness. For some things linen was used, and for others hair, in keeping with the purposes of the fabrics. There were also places where skins dyed red were suitable to the beauty of the structure. Chapter 51. After his descent from the mountain, Moses, employing workmen, constructed these things according to the pattern shown to him. While he was in that sanctuary not made with hands, he was commanded how the priest should be adorned when he entered the sanctuary. The law prescribed the details of the under and outer garments. So we see in this particular case that St. Gregory is saying that quite obviously Moses was given more than just the 10 commandments. He was actually shown the design of the tabernacle and told what to do about its structure, how to set it up, and also he was told obviously how to clothe the priests. Chapter 52. The first in order of the garments was not the hidden but the visible. There was an ephod embroidered of different colors with gold thread predominating. The veil was also made of these colors. Clasps held the ephod together on both sides and provided a setting of gold for emeralds. The beauty of these stones was due partly to their natural radiance. From them a green brightness was given forth, and partly to the marvelous skill of the engraving. This was not the skill which carves out images of gold, but the adornment was the names of the patriarch engraved 6 on each stone. From the clasps down, chapter 53, down the front, the little shield-like ornaments hung loosely. There were also intertwined cords plaited through one another in a net-like pattern hanging from the clasps on each side. They dropped down from the shield-like ornaments so that the beauty of the plating might, I think, be more conspicuous, being enhanced by the background. Chapter 54. The ornament made out of gold, which hung down from the chest, had on it stones of different kinds, equal in number to the patriarchs. And of course there were 12 patriarchs, as we know, the 12 sons of, Jacob. These were arranged in 4 rows, set 3 to a row, with the names of the tribes written on them. The tunic beneath the ephod extended from the neck to the toes and was suitably adorned with fringes. The hem was decked out beautifully, not only by the variety of skilled weaving, but also by the hanging of gold ornaments. These were golden bells and pomegranates distributed alternately along the hem. Chapter 55. The fillet for the head was solid violet, and the metal leaf front piece was of pure gold engraved with the ineffable letters. There was also a girdle which held together the loose folds of the garment, as well as an adornment for the hidden parts of the body, and the other articles of clothing which symbolically instruct concerning priestly virtue under the form of clothing. Chapter 56. After he was instructed in these and other such things by the ineffable teaching of God, while he was surrounded by that invisible darkness, and having surpassed himself by the aid of the mystical doctrines, he emerged again out of the darkness. He then went down to his people to share with them the marvels which had been shown to him in the theophany, or the manifestation of God, to deliver the laws, and to institute for them the sanctuary and priesthood according to the patterns shown to him on the mountain. Chapter 57. He carried in his hands the holy tablets, which were a divine invention and gift that needed no human cooperation to be brought into existence. Both the material and the writing on them were equally the work of God. The writing was the law, but the people prevented grace. Before giving heed to the lawgiver, they rebelled in idolatry. So what he is talking about here now is the fact that they urged Aaron to make them a molten golden calf. And they danced around it and played and said that this golden calf led them out of Egypt. And by that, of course, they mightily upset Moses. Chapter 58. Some considerable time had elapsed while Moses devoted himself to conversation with God and that divine initiation. He participated in that eternal life under the darkness for 40 days and nights, and lived in a state beyond nature. For his body had no need of food during that time. It was then that the people, like a little child who escapes the attention of his pedagogue, were carried along into disorderliness by uncontrolled impulses, and banding together against Aaron, forced the priest to lead them in idolatry. Chapter 59. When the idol had been made out of gold, it was a calf. They exulted in their impiety, but Moses came to them and broke the tablets which he had received from God, so that they might suffer punishment worthy of their transgression by having no share in the God-given grace. So he was upset with them, and I think he threw the tablets on the ground, and of course he crushed them. Chapter 60. He then purified his people's guilt with their own blood when the Levites slew them, and appeased the divine by his own anger against the transgressors. Thereupon he utterly destroyed the idol. Once more applying himself to the matter for 40 days, he received the tablets. The writing on them was done by divine power, but the material was fashioned by the hand of Moses. He received them, while for the same number of days he again lived beyond nature in a manner different from that to which we are accustomed, and admitted to his body none of those sustenances which our nature requires. So basically, St. Gregory of Nyssa is saying here that Moses fasted for 40 days initially, and then after he punished the transgressors who made the golden calf and committed adultery, he fasted for yet another 40 days in order to receive the new tablets. Essentially the same law written, but on the new tablets, because he crushed the first ones. Chapter 61. Moses accordingly erected for them the tabernacle, delivered to them the laws, and established the priesthood in keeping with the teaching given to him by God. The workmanship on all the material objects was done according to divine directions: the tabernacle, the entrances, and everything inside, the altar of incense, the altar of holocaust, the candlestick, the curtains, the propitiatory within the Holy of Holies, the adornment of the priesthood, the myrrh, the different sacrifices, the purification, the thank offerings, the offerings to avert evil, the propitiations for trespasses. As he arranged everything in the required manner among his family, he aroused against himself envy, that congenial malady in the nature of man. Chapter 62. I guess maybe before I make any comments on the envy, we should read on, because probably St. Gregory mentions that himself now that he addressed it. Chapter 62. Even Aaron, who was endowed with the honors of the priesthood, and his sister Miriam, driven by most female-like jealousy against the honor given to Moses by God, so railed against him that deity was provoked to punish their trespass. So basically, they greatly angered God by rebelling against Moses, you might say. Here Moses showed patience, most worthy of admiration, because when God punished the irrational envy of the woman, he made his nature prevail over anger and appeased God on behalf of his sister. Basically, we know that when he saw that Miriam was struck with leprosy because of her envy against him, or, an envy directed toward him, Moses actually prayed for her to God that she be healed, and she was. And of course, that St. Gregory calls him prevailing, made his nature prevailing over anger, because he could have thought, you got what you rightly deserve. Why did you envy me? Why did you rebel against me? But even though she did sin against him, he prayed for her deliverance from leprosy, and she was healed. Chapter 62. The multitude again fell into disorderliness. What led to their transgression was a lack of moderation in regard to the pleasures of the table, for they were not satisfied to live healthily and painlessly on the food which flowed down from above, but the craving for meat made them prefer slavery in Egypt to their present good circumstances. Moses took counsel with God concerning the passion which had overcome them, and God instructed that they should not have such desires, because he would give them what they longed for. He sent flocks of birds like a cloud to fly close to the ground near the camp. The ease with which they could catch the birds led them, in their craving for meat, to stuff themselves. So they were definitely overeating. Now, let's see. There's a question here. Is Moses' throwing of the tablets considered an example of righteous anger? How might we carefully think about this emotion possibly occurring in our lives? Well, if Moses threw the tablets down, then of course the Lord took the whip and overturned the tables of the money changers within the temple, and with the whip he drew those who were sort of making commerce in his house, which he said, of course, my house is the house of prayer. It's not the house of, sort of merchandise. So, yes, I do think that, and considering the fact that Moses also punished, or, righteous prophet, holy prophet Moses, also punished those who misbehaved, because some of them died, and I can't remember how they were slaughtered. Maybe they were slaughtered by the priests. At least a portion of the people were cut down for sure. So definitely this would have been righteous anger. Now, the only sort of main danger for us is to consider, if we were to give into anger, is our anger righteous? Now, we see that Moses could have been righteously and rightfully angry with Miriam, but once she was struck down by God with leprosy, or struck with leprosy, he prayed for her healing. He had mercy on his own sister. And while others might say, well, she's a sister, no wonder, of course, anyone would pray for his brother or for his sister or for his child or for his parent. But we also know that Moses, as I mentioned earlier, when God was going to wipe out the Israelite nation, Moses prayed and said, Lord, if you're going to wipe them out, wipe me out with them. And so we see that inasmuch as he exhibited righteous anger and he threw the plates, the stone plates, the sort of the scrolls with the commandments onto the ground, crushing them, in the same way he was also an example, a living example of self-sacrifice and of utmost and purest love for his fellow countrymen. So maybe he could exhibit such anger. As for us, I don't know that that would be such a safe idea, because we would probably justify ourselves that our anger is just, but we would end up only offending those near us. And especially, like, some people say, oh, my anger is justified, and they unleash their anger on their family members, causing so much pain and suffering, when in fact they could have handled the situation differently. So I think, and also in that particular case, most likely the crushing of the tablets, the original ones, the ones given to him by God, was most likely the only action that would have gotten the Israelites' attention as to their transgression and what they were doing. If he came and simply tried speaking to them, they might not have listened, because we do know that when someone said to them, well, what about Moses? What's he going to say about this golden calf when he comes down the mountain? And some of those activists, you might say, some of the people who were getting everybody else riled up, come on, let's make an idol, let's make a god for ourselves that we can see, And when they were asked, well, what about Moses? They said, what about Moses? We don't know where he's at. He's gone. He's disappeared. It's been so many days and we have not seen or heard of him. So they were definitely very heedless when it comes to Moses, considering he led them with so many miracles. And yet, when he was praying on the mountain and fasting for 40 days, they said, well, we don't know of him. Where is he? He's disappeared. He's gone. Essentially, like, he vanished. So he came and he threw the tablets down. Are we ever in that same position? And I imagine so. Think of it this way. Oftentimes, I say to parents, if you're a little child, 2.5, maybe 3 years old, even a 4 or 5-year-old, is about to run out in front of a car on the street, if you say, honey, you really shouldn't do that, what's going to happen? Your child is going to die. Because you normally speak like that when there is nothing major happening. If your child is about to spill the milk, you go, oh, careful, but you don't scream and shout. You say, or, if they're doing something at home, you speak calmly, you behave. If your child is about to run out in front of a running car, you yell, you scream, and if that doesn't work, you run and you hope that you grab your child by the sort of scruff of the neck and get him out of the harm's way, or if it's not the car but something else, when the child is trying to stick the hand into, the fireplace, and you say once, honey, don't do that. You say twice, honey, don't do that. Well, a crazy person might say, okay, go ahead and put it in and burn the child's hand. But, in some cases you might say, don't do that, ouch, you're going to get hurt. And, even if that doesn't work, well, the child is going to get burned, right? And by then, of course, maybe, hopefully, you'd think it would be a lesson learned. So, in that particular case, was that righteous anger? Well, of course, for Moses, it would not have been an unrighteous anger. However, later on, when Moses was commanded by God to speak to the rock, but he was so angry with the Israelites and their continuous grumbling and so on, that he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. Then, if you recall, the Lord told him, because you disobeyed me, because you were told to speak to the rock, not to strike it. Striking the first time, speaking the second time. But because he was so angry, he struck it the second time. And the Lord told him, you will not enter the promised land. So, righteous anger, is there such a thing? Yes. Are we capable of it? Are we readily sort of capable of identifying, oh, this is righteous anger for me, it's okay. This is not righteous, I better control myself. I'd say probably it's the best thing to control yourself 99% of the time, maybe even 99.9% of the time, and allow yourself only a small fraction, of a percentage point to say, well, this is righteous anger, because sometimes what we consider to be righteous anger is perceived by our family members, by our children, by our spouses, as a passionate anger. So, but yes, as you're right, parents with children, I think that does help because it puts things for all of us into perspective. Imagine a teacher who always gives straight A to a student that doesn't do his homework, that doesn't learn anything. Well, what's going to happen to that student when that student goes to the university from school and the professor there is not going to be the same? And much worse, what if the professor at the university does the same? And let's say the student is studying to be a trauma doctor. Then what? If the student who wanted to be a trauma doctor was given a pass every single time and no one ever told him that he needs to learn and he needs to practice, when he gets a live patient in front of him who's going to be in serious need of medical assistance and he's not going to be able to help the patient is going to suffer either death or perhaps maybe serious consequential problems because the medical assistance was not offered right away in a way that it should have. And then, of course, that sorry person who was never admonished properly to study will be eaten by his conscience and will have to carry tremendous amount of guilt because he will realize that, oops, I guess because I didn't do my studies, I didn't learn properly, well, my patient died, or my patient didn't do as well as he could have or she should have, and so on. Chapter 64. Their immoderation at once became destructive to their bodies, and their satiety ended in sickness and death. This is when they were overeating the quail that just flooded their camp. This example became to them and to those watching them a sufficient cause for moderation. So basically, yes, fasting is not meant to teach us to abstain radically to the point of sort of physical hurt to our bodies, or even damage in some cases, as people do when they fast without reasonable measure. Fasting is meant to teach us moderation, that we can actually control ourselves. Chapter 65. Next, Moses sent spies into that region which they hoped to inhabit according to the divine promise. When not all of them reported the truth, but some gave false and discouraging information, the people again rose in anger against Moses. God decreed that those who had no confidence in divine help should not see the promised land. Now, this is something actually quite interesting, and I think that perhaps we could pause on this for a moment, especially considering the fact that maybe this is a good place to stop altogether, and I made a bookmark in the book. But think of it this way. So there were 12 spies sent into the promised land. Of them, 10 said, it's going to be impossible for us to inhabit this land. They have fortified cities, which was not necessarily a lie because Jericho did have a wall. But God had a way of dealing with a wall, as we will see later, um, after the death of Moses, obviously, because it was Joshua who led them to conquer Jericho. And then they also said that there were giants inhabiting the land, that they were very, very sort of militant and hard looking, and it would be impossible for the Israelites to inhabit the land, actually to sort of claim its possession. Now, of those spies, only two, Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb, were the ones who said we should go and possess the land and God will help us, because with his help it's possible for us to inhabit it. But because they were basically 2 against 10, the people listened to the 10. Here's a hint about democracy, by the way. I don't mean to engage in politics at all. But basically, we see that what happened to the Israelites was that the democratic rule was no. They were not going to do that. 10 out of 12 spies said it's impossible. We can't do this. We're not going to be able to inhabit this land. It's too much. Let's not do that. So they said, let's not do that. They rebelled against Moses. And of course, the punishment was actually quite horrific and tremendous. God commanded them to wander in the desert to, what's the other word? Sort of to be exiled in the desert for 40 years. And during that 40 years, everyone who was 20 years of age at the time of the decision made based on the sort of false report of the 10 spies, everyone who was 20 died. So the promised land was inhabited by those who would have been under 20, so 19 and younger. The children survived, those who were 19 years old, by the time they actually crossed the River Jordan and went into the promised land. The youngest people would have been 59, or 59 plus something. But everyone who was 20 at that time, in the hearing of those 10 spies, they all died. The 10 spies died. They died in the desert. The only 2 people of those 12 spies who saw the promised land were Caleb and Joshua. That really does say something to us. And of course, Moses, because of sort of striking the rock, he was also told by God that he would not see the promised land, but that he would die beforehand. Thus, it was actually Joshua who had to lead them into the promised land, who had sort of taken up the burden of leadership after the death of Moses. And that is a tremendous example. That is something that is very much for us to consider. Now, think of it this way. So you had 10 people out of 12. So the majority, the overwhelming majority said, it's impossible. It's impossible. We can't conquer this land. We can't, take these fortified cities. We can't fight these giants, who live there. Think of the parallel, of the spiritual parallel to our modern day. How many people nowadays are saying, oh, Father, come on. You should give communion to everyone because it's impossible to live a pious life. It's impossible not to fornicate. It's impossible not to do drugs. It's impossible not to, do whatever, cheat and steal and so on, because everybody lives like that. Well, but we see in the example of Moses and the 12 spies and the Israelites that those who considered it to be impossible were condemned to die in the desert. They never saw the promised land. So if you think that the life of virtue is impossible, my sad news to you is that you will never see it. You will die without it. If you think that the attainment of the kingdom of heaven is impossible, you will never attain it. Think, even the modern day psychologists say, if you think that something cannot be done, you can't do it. Not that sort of cheating yourself or pretending to be, how some of those people that we all think are very insincere and, sort of lacking authenticity. When you ask them how they're doing, oh, I'm great, everything is great, I can do anything, and then, when they actually face tribulations and trials, they crack just like anybody else. They break down, they cry, and so on. Was the battle for the habitation of the promised land difficult? Did some warriors of Israel perhaps die during the process? Of course. It took them time as well once they crossed the River Jordan. And I'm sorry, I'm running ahead of the book a little bit, but it took them time. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, meaning that it requires an effort, and violent men take it by force. Well, Joshua and Caleb said, let's go. Let's do it. Let's apply force. Let's apply violence in order, to sort of conquer the promised land. And hopefully with God's help, we can do it. Well, I dare say to you, try to apply the same mentality of Joshua and Caleb to your Christian life. Yes, I will go out and struggle for virtue. I will fail miserably, maybe time and again. I will fall, I will sin, but I will not give up. I'll keep getting up on my feet, and I will try to possess the promised land, the kingdom of heaven. I will try to attain to it. And that's a very, very, I think, very serious example and a serious lesson for us to learn. Well, thank you so much. I definitely agree. Being a priest is not an easy task, especially in our day and age. But hopefully by your prayers and by the grace of God, God willing, like Caleb and Joshua, somehow, not by my abilities, but by God's grace, I can make it. Let's stop for today, and God willing, we will continue on April the 26th. That's a Wednesday. Next Wednesday at our regular time. I don't think that we're going to have any reasons not to. As I always say, I would like to thank all the contributors, all the supporters of our humble, small channel. We don't have a lot of subscribers and we don't boast many views, but I think that the most important thing is not the numbers of people, not the numbers of subscribers or the numbers of views or likes as such or comments, but I think the most important thing for us is the actual subject matter that we cover, the things that we discuss, the works of the Holy Fathers that we read, I think are inspiring, very helpful, and of course, thank you all for your prayers, for your support, and both spiritual and material, and God willing, we will see you soon again. God bless you, and let us pray, and we'll say goodbye. I'll try to do it by memory. Shine, shine, O New Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. Rejoice now and be glad, O Zion, and be radiant of your Theotokos and the resurrection of thy Son. Something like that. Forgive me for my, slightly dusty English, liturgical English. Mostly, of course, our services are in Church Slavonic, so please say a prayer for me. God bless, and Christ is risen.